Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tackling a massive mystery that's gripped the world for over a century, the wreck of the RMS Titanic. We're going to dive deep into the monumental engineering hurdles, the absolute wildest ideas people have pitched to bring it back to the surface, and the startling biological realities that mean our time to act is, quite literally, ticking away.
So right off the bat, we gotta ask, with auction houses selling off artifacts for absolutely exorbitant prices since the wreck was found in 1985, why hasn't this iconic ship just been refloated? I mean, pulling it up would stop all the looting and save it from rotting to nothing, right? Plus, can you imagine the museum ticket sales? But as we're about to see, the ocean doesn't exactly play nice.
The whole problem really comes down to one staggering number: 3,800. The Titanic sits a crushing 3,800 meters below the surface. That is nearly 4 kilometers of deep, pitch black, incredibly heavy water sitting on top of it. The sheer physics of just operating at that depth makes almost any traditional recovery operation practically impossible. To put that crazy depth into perspective, think about this. Back in 1961, Sweden actually successfully raised a sunken 17th century ship that had been underwater for over 300 years. Today, that 70-meter-long vessel sits in their most visited museum. But here's the catch. That Swedish ship was only 32 meters down. Even the largest salvage operation in history, which raised an entire 45-ship German fleet a century ago, only dealt with a max depth of 45 meters. The Titanic's 3,800-meter abyss, yeah, that is an entirely different beast. If we want to find a salvage operation at a comparable depth, we actually have to look away from commercial companies and look at the CIA. Back in 1974, they ran a top-secret mission called Project Azorian to try and raise the Soviet K-129 submarine from an astonishing 4,900 meters down. They literally had to build a massive custom vessel just for that one specific mission. And that CIA op brilliantly illustrates the massive risk here. In today's money, that mission costs the equivalent of $4 billion. And get this, even with limitless government funding and totally custom engineering, it wasn't even a complete success. During the ascent, their massive lifting claws suffered a mechanical failure, and 2/3 of the Soviet sub broke apart and sank right back down to the bottom. Despite that impossible reality and the jaw-dropping costs of deep-sea recovery, pop culture is still totally obsessed with the ship. Just look at the box office. James Cameron's 1997 movie pulled in a massive $2 billion, making it the third highest-grossing film of all time. That movie single-handedly reignited the global debate about whether modern tech could finally bring the real ship home. But it's wild to contrast Cameron's blockbuster with an older movie. Even before the real wreck was found in '85, there was a 1980 film literally called Raise the Titanic that fantasized about, well, refloating the vessel. While Cameron's romance made billions, that 1980 movie absolutely bombed in real life, losing $33 million. Turns out, Raising the Titanic is a disaster even in fiction. Okay, so moving past Hollywood, how could engineers actually pull this off in the real world? What if we skipped the $4 billion CIA cranes and tried something totally out of the box? Like, what if we filled the ship with ping pong balls? I know it sounds crazy, but let's look at some of the actual proposals people have pitched over the years. First up, the ping pong balls. Sure, Mythbusters proved that 27,000 of them could lift a small sunken boat, but the immense pressure at 3,800 meters, it would instantly crush them. Then there was the idea to fill polyester bags with 180,000 tons of petroleum jelly or hot wax. Again, the water pressure would just burst the bags. How about wrapping the ship in a metal mesh and pumping in 500,000 tons of liquid nitrogen to freeze a giant iceberg around it? Or maybe dropping giant deep-sea magnets down on cables? Yeah, all of these are logistical nightmares that completely ignore the brutal physics of the deep ocean. So, the wild sci-fi methods are out, which brings us to the idea of a partial victory. If we can't lift the whole ship, what about taking it up piece by piece? This brings us to a really fascinating timeline. Back in 1996, a company tried to raise a 20-ton section of the hull. They even turned it into a massive public spectacle for 1,700 paying onlookers on cruise ships. But disaster struck. Just 60 meters from the surface, the rope snapped and the piece plummeted all the way back down to the bottom. They didn't give up, though. They finally succeeded in 1998, and today, that big piece sits in the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, alongside about 250 other artifacts. While we managed to save that one 20-ton piece, leaving the rest of the massive ship down there is turning into a desperate race against a biological clock. It's not just sitting perfectly preserved in the dark, waiting for us. And this is where things get really wild. Meet Halomonas titanicae. This is a voracious bacteria that had never even been discovered before. Scientists found it on the wreck. It is quite literally eating the iron structure of the ship. They actually named this entirely new species in honor of the vessel it's actively feeding on, which is kind of mind-blowing. But that hungry bacteria isn't working alone. The harsh marine environment has wreaked absolute havoc over the last century. You've got highly acidic water dissolving the ship's integrity, and microbes causing rust growth that erodes the hull. The interior cabins are in awful shape, with decks and passageways literally collapsing in on themselves. It's actually gotten so bad that it's now too dangerous for even robotic mini-submarines to navigate the crumbling interior. The decomposition is happening so fast, in fact, that we're staring down a terrifying deadline. Some experts dare to predict that the entire ship, this monumental piece of human history, will completely dissolve and vanish by the year 2030. That is literally just around the corner. With that shocking 2030 expiration date looming so large, we are left with this intense ethical, historical, and financial dilemma. What on earth do we do with the time we have left? The global community is severely split on this. On one hand, you have preservationists and opportunists who believe we should salvage absolutely every artifact we can before the ship vanishes forever into the sea. But on the other side, you have folks arguing forcefully that the site must remain an undisturbed mass grave, out of respect for the 1,500 people who lost their lives in the 1912 disaster. Now, regarding that mass grave argument, oceanographers point out a really stark biological reality. After hundreds of dives down to the wreck, there is absolutely no evidence of human remains left anywhere. The extreme ocean conditions and the voracious marine life down there have consumed everything, leaving no physical trace of the victims behind.
So where does that leave the ship today? Well, because it sits in international waters, the wreck was placed under UNESCO protection back in 2012, exactly 100 years after it sank, to oversee its preservation. Visiting it is an extreme luxury. Companies like OceanGate were charging staggering ticket prices, doubling to $250,000 for a seat in 2022. Because of that massive price tag, only about 200 people have ever made the thrilling journey down to see it firsthand.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we are staring straight down the barrel of that 2030 prediction. Before the Titanic potentially disintegrates forever, we have to ask ourselves a serious question. Do we attempt one last massive multi-billion-dollar salvage operation to save what's left of this history? Or is it time for human hubris to step aside and finally let the ocean claim the Titanic once and for all? And maybe the biggest question of all, do you think Leonardo DiCaprio could have actually fit on that door? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning.